watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and I'm most pleased to welcome back an individual who brings unusual insight to issues confronting the state of Israel and world Jewry, and a man of profound passion for Jewish people everywhere. One of the Jerusalem Post's leading columnists today, Isi Leibler. For many years, Isi has occupied a major leadership position within the Jewish community of Australia, and during that period of time, Isi was instrumental in initiating the movement to save Soviet Jewry. He was the first to bring this plight of Soviet Jews before the United Nations, and he visited the Soviet Union many times to meet with dissidents and to help them form a viable freedom movement. Now living in Israel, Isi Leibler is a major voice on the moderate right, and you can read his weekly columns in the Jerusalem Post, or you can receive them online, as I and my wife do, and it's a pleasure to be sitting with you again. Isi, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Mark. Good to be here.
What's your feeling as you talk to American Jews these days?
I think that there's a feeling of great concern as to the future. There's a concern about the political future, where it's going. There's also...
You sense that in your discussions with American Jewish leaders?
Absolutely.
Their concern is with what? Where American Jewry is going in the political landscape here, or the interaction between America and Israel?
Both. Very clearly both. I think there's a concern that there are trends within American Jewry which are moving away from Israel. I think that those trends are magnified somewhat by the press on the basis of what I've seen, but I'm not living here and I can't make a proper assessment. And there's also a concern about what's going to be the future with Israel, because Israel's going to go through a very difficult time, and the relationship with the United States is critical and crucial. And I think everybody from right and left and center all want to see a strong bipartisan relationship in this country maintained.
You wrote in a recent column about what you called a unity statement issued by Abe Foxman of the ADL and David Harris of the AJC, the American Jewish Committee. Comment in general for me on your feeling about that unity agreement and the response you saw in the American Jewish community to it.
I think it's misleading to talk about it as a unity agreement. I think the mistake in this particular context, and I've said that to the people concerned, and I must tell you, I have the highest regard for Abe Foxman and for his colleague from the American Jewish, for David Harris. But I feel that if it would have been concentrating on the need to maintain bipartisanship, I'm with one. If it would have been a need to ensure that one doesn't speak in extreme hyperboles about politics, I totally agree with that. If it means that one should also be praiseworthy of positive things done by an American administration, fine. But what I think was perhaps inadvisedly put forward, virtually a suggestion that in order to maintain a feeling that there is sobriety in the Jewish community, the best thing to do is to opt out of the political battle. That was implicit, even if not intended, but that was the implicit outcome.
Are you saying that you think that it is an inappropriate strategy for Jews today?
Very inappropriate, because I believe the important thing of Jewish leadership, both here in the United States and for that matter, Jewish leadership everywhere, and I've gone through this myself, so it's not just a columnist from the outside talking. When you're a Jewish leader, you are worried about a number of concerns. You don't want to antagonize the people who are going to have power and push them to go further. And you also want to be able to have a situation where you can maintain access with them, because if you can't talk to them, you feel you're cut out. Now, I've come to the conclusion that ultimately these things, important though they are secondary. The most important thing that a Jewish community leadership has to do is to be prepared to stand up and be critical when they feel that people are doing things that are against the interest of the Jewish world or unfair to Israel. And likewise, they should be very careful to extend praise when good things are done. And with respect to this country, I think that with regard to President Obama, notwithstanding all the good things he's doing a lot of good things. I mean, in terms of the military support he's given Israel, there's been absolutely nothing to question or challenge on it. And in recent times, he's even been more positive on the political arena, although people can ask whether that was because of politics, because of pressures, because of an election year, or whatever. But at the same time, he has also been extraordinarily hostile, in my opinion, in terms of the way he has handled us in Israel in relation to the Palestinians. He's been much tougher.
Give us some specific examples.
He has continuously been beating up Israel on issues that no American president has beforehand. For example, I can understand a contentious issue of settlements. That is a contentious issue even in Israel. But to suggest that Israel should stop building in what is Jewish Jerusalem, and I mean Jewish Jerusalem because this is not a question of ever coming into a negotiating pattern with the Arabs, to suggest that they have to stop there after you've had a prime minister who's gone all the way and done what no other Labour or other prime minister has done, and unprecedentedly agreed to a 10-month freeze, which brought him no good responses whatsoever from the Arabs. I think that that's an indication. Whereas towards the Arabs, until recently, the incitement and the culture of evil which pervades the Palestinian Authority, not just Hamas, but the Palestinian Authority, to my mind, this is something that should be coming out more from American leaders, should be talking about this. And when they make monuments for these mass murderers, and when they sanctify them and hold them up in schools as role model projects, when they talk about a Judenrein, Palestinian state, a state where no Jew will be permitted to live in. For goodness sake, how can an American president, particularly an American president with a background of President Obama, who understands what racism is, remain silent on that? And I believe a Jewish community, in a very responsible and restrained manner, should have made these points in a much more vigorous manner. Although I must say, to his credit, Abe Foxman, in the early days, spoke up very strongly and said things that none of the other Jewish leaders did. And when I speak to Jewish leaders, their motivations are good. They're saying to me, look, if we push him to the edge, and we create a situation where if he's re-elected, he'll be more vigorous. I say that, to my mind, tactically and strategically, is not right. A Jewish community which stands up and is recognized by all parties as being principled and speaking up positively and negatively, they will gain the respect. Remaining silent or opting out of it would be a catastrophe, because it would mean that the Jewish community no longer acts to protect its own interests and to promote its own interests.
Many people feel that the speech that President Obama gave at the United Nations, rejecting any suggestion that the UN should grant statehood to the Palestinians, that it was a very pro-Israeli speech, and for the first time it was not at the same time saying something pro-Israel, in some way also saying something of a pro-Palestinian nature. Did that have meaning for you?
Very much. To my mind, when he made that statement, I was one of those myself who got up and said very, very clearly, this is one of the most pro-Israel statements any American president has done. Now, all I have to say that, and forgive me, I'm not an American, and there's a certain amount of chutzpah when I say that. I say that with a certain amount of concern when I recollect the zigzags that he indulged in before he was elected and after he was elected. I hope he stays on that path, and this is not an election thing. But in terms of praise, he should have been praised and recognized by every Jew, irrespective, right, left, or center.
I was recently at the General Assembly of the Jewish Federations of North America in Denver. And at one of the sessions, the Israel director of the JFNA, at one of the sessions, one of the breakout sessions, put up a whole series of slides that showed the results of polls taking of Israeli public opinion. One of the slides she showed, Izzy, asked the question of how Israelis feel about President Obama's attitude towards Israel. To my surprise, the most recent poll showed that 54% of Israelis now think that President Obama is pro-Israel, while only 19% find him to be pro-Palestinian and 27% say he's neutral. Do you feel this honestly reflects a change in the Israeli people's attitude towards President Obama?
No, I do not, and I don't consider this poll to be precise, reflecting a change of attitude. What there has been is a recognition that the President Obama in the last few months has been doing good things, but there is still, and you will find it throughout Israel, a great concern about his attitude towards Israel and a great concern that he may go back to what he was beforehand. That's their concern.
The concern is it's politically motivated rather than motivated out of sincere conviction.
A lot of people fear that, but the proof is in the pudding. I have a philosophy with politicians. I never believe in judging a politician by what is in his heart. I judge him by his actions, and that's the only way one should judge a politician. And so long as the president continues to do the right thing and doesn't kind of forget himself with his little conversations with Sarkozy and allow some rather unpleasant things to come out, when he does the right thing, he should be praised, unquestionably. That's where Jewish leaders have to rise above politics, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. When the president, irrespective of which party he is, does the right thing, praise him. When he does something which is clearly bad, be critical of him in a respectful manner and without going to hysteria and without using terms like anti-Semitic and all the other extreme words that have come out in the past, which I think are counterproductive.
You do, however, refer to the extent to which the Obama administration, when it comes to giving military aid to Israel and financial aid in general, has been outstanding.
Outstanding. It has continued and expanded on previous administrations, and Israel could not wish to have a better relationship on this score than before.
Isn't there something of a strange dichotomy here? Because on the one hand, you do point out you want to see what actions come out of an administration. And in terms of aid, military aid and financial aid, the Obama administration, as you've just said, has even extended some of the policies of prior administrations. What bothers you is a certain kind of rhetoric that the president has expressed, which fits some of the general philosophy he has about being accommodating, whether it's to Iran or the Muslim world. So as you evaluate those two in your own mind, do you ever say to yourself, his actions for me, Isi Leibler, outweigh some of the rhetoric?
No, because ultimately the fight that we've got now is not just a military battle. The fight we've got now is extraordinarily important on the political level. And if the American administration were to throw us to the wolves, which they have not done yet, but if they were to throw us to the wolves...
But it's not even yet. Have they even come close?
Well, let me say that the way they treated us in relation to the Palestinians and the Arab world in general showed a bias against us, an indifference, and a clear, to my mind, and I may be wrong, but to my mind, move away from the identification of previous presidents. There was a distancing, a deliberate distancing from Israel, and I think that that is part of the third world attitude of the administration in many areas, and the engagement which failed with Iran and with tyrannical regimes. The madness, in my opinion, of looking at the Muslim Brotherhood as a potentially positive force, and that's come out from some of the administration people. This, to me, is Planet of the Apes. It's very worrying because this is so far off the map. The Muslim Brotherhood we have to remind ourselves, is the mother of Hamas. They created Hamas. And to say that these are people that the American administration sees as outcome of democracy, it shows you, there's much more in democracy than votes. And just having an electoral system, I am certainly not a great lover of Mubarak. Mubarak was an autocrat and not good to Israel, but in relative terms, if you're going to put him up with what I fear we're going to be facing, we're going to look back nostalgically to this so-and-so.
Mm-hmm. That always is an issue of complexity, because on the
Yes.
one hand, you have a feeling what would be good for the people of Egypt, and sometimes what might be good for the people of Egypt at the present time would not be good for the state of Israel. And
I don't agree with you
And there
there.
are others who argue that if the Muslim Brotherhood would have come to power in Egypt, it wouldn't be good for the Egyptian
It would be
people
terrible
either.
for the Egyptians.
But getting rid of Mubarak might have been good for the Egyptian people.
If he was, depending on what he's replaced, I mean, to create a vacuum and have something worse coming in is not an answer. Mm-hmm. I mean, and that the whole Arab Spring is in that context. If you look at the whole Arab Spring, to me, we're going to be facing a real Arab winter, no spring.
Those who support the Obama administration, they argue that you have a president who is not anti-Israel, but has this maybe naive but well-meaning philosophy that if you talk to other people, if you engage other people, if you bring them to the table, you ultimately can work out solutions which have eluded past administrations.
Yes.
But their answer is, it's not because he's anti-Israel. It's not because he wants to throw Israel to the wolves. It's that he believes that there should be a state of Israel with an integrity of its own, but that somehow there must be some meeting of the minds, and that he does not in any way mean to be anti-Israel when he talks about settlements or pre-67 boundaries with land swaps. All he's trying to do is create a context in which the two sides will sit together. And you say?
And I say to you that if you say that he is not hostile to Israel, I would say that at the very least, and I'm being very charitable, he's indifferent. Because his whole course has been so one-sided in terms of making demands on Netanyahu, and making Netanyahu, who to my mind, look, I'm not a great chassid of his. I see weaknesses. I've written a piece this week about Netanyahu where I show the pros and cons of the man. But he has really gone out of his way to try to reach an accommodation with an American president. And he has moved the country from the right to the center. He has gone far beyond people even like Rabin, who they use as a role model. He's gone far beyond Rabin in what he's offered the Palestinians, but he's being pictured by President Obama and his followers in very negative terms. And I say that creates an environment where, with the United Nations and the international community, a wink from an American president, even if he doesn't say it himself, can cause us enormous difficulties and problems. He has come back now. I hope that it is because of inner realization and not politics, but that, we'll see that in due course. Mm-hmm. Now, the best intentions in the world doesn't matter if the ultimate result is negative and we don't have two chances. Mm-hmm. I'll never forget the statement he made to a group of American leaders once, and he said, you should read your hearts and ask yourself whether you've done enough to try to persuade your colleagues in Israel to fight for peace. Something to those words, something to that effect. I'm not sure, that wasn't the exact quotation, but something to that effect. And all I can say to you is, for goodness sake, when you look at what we have offered the Palestinians in the last, never mind the last 20 years, but the last 2 years, since the administration of Bibi has come in, what we've offered, it's all been one way. And every time we've made a compromise, all that's happened is they've accepted and they've used that as a stepping stone to embolden themselves to make even greater and greater demands. We've never faced as an intransigent. You would think that the Palestinian Authority are the people who won the war of aggression against us, and that we're pleading for them. It is an impossible situation. And I would hope that the American people will continue supporting us as they do, and it reflects itself in Congress, which is very, very important. and that this will have an influence in the long term, irrespective of how the administration goes.
You know, in some sectors of the American Jewish community, people are very mistrustful of Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yes.
And they believe that he's lying. But it's the Sarkozy's statement, he's a liar. But that many American Jews will say they don't trust Netanyahu, and that it's interesting, no matter what he does, their feeling is he's duplicitous, and that he really has no intention of ever making peace with the Palestinians, and that when he says things like, I will meet with Mahmoud Abbas any place at any time for direct negotiations without preconditions. Without preconditions is a separate issue. He doesn't mean it, and that under no circumstance would he ever be the Prime Minister of Israel who would effectuate a two-state solution. It's not like you are giving Benjamin Netanyahu a pass. You've said you've written about the good and the bad. But to what extent do you feel the American Jewish community that has that view of Netanyahu is completely off base?
I think they're completely off base, but there are a lot of Israelis that have the same attitude.
Why is that?
I think that with all his qualities, he has managed, in the personal sense, not to capture the warmth and attraction of people. And people regard him as being devious without any proof and without any substance. The reality is that in the last 2 years, he has offered to do all the right things. When one of his offers is taken up and he rejects it, then one can criticize him. But till now, what more? He has moved Likud, which was an intransigent party in terms of a two-state solution, towards recognition of two states. He's offered to have negotiations without preconditions. What more can one want? He had a 10-month freeze, which I must say to you, no other Prime Minister would have ever contemplated doing. The guy has gone really
He gets
over.
no credit for it.
No.
And not only does he get no credit for it, he is criticized for then not being willing to extend it when the freeze ran out in September.
Yes.
Should he have extended it?
No.
But many Israelis think he should have also.
Most Israelis are very much opposed to extending it.
Why?
Because there's no point in extending it. Why should he extend a situation when the Arabs, all it has done, the Palestinians had 10 months to sit around a table after
Okay, but
he did
Abbas
that.
came in the 10th month.
Sorry?
Abbas came in the 10th month. They both came to Washington. And the process began. Why not play it out and see where it would go?
Because there's a limit. He promises the nation, and he promises the right wing of his constituency, I'm giving this a 10-month go. I promise you that after 10 months, if nothing happens, I go back to normal. He has to keep a certain amount of credibility to his own constituency as well as to the Palestinians and the rest of the world.
He could have spun it.
I don't think so.
He could have said, the fact that they came in the 10th month is a victory for the peace process. And let's extend it to see whether, in fact,
They didn't
it
come.
moves forward.
They didn't come. They made conditions. And the conditions were worsened because here President Obama jumped in with 67 borders a few months later and all the rest of it. These things made life very, very difficult for him. He had announced before he came to the United States, just before he came to the United States, he announced that he was flexible. He made a general statement about flexibility over settlements. He arrives and expected to be greeted by the president, and the president kind of sandbagged him with this 67 border situation. Because the 67 borders with swaps, if you analyze that very carefully, it means that unless we get swaps, we go back to the 67 borders, including Jerusalem, including everything else.
That's not what it says.
Yes, it does.
It
It
says-
says with swaps, but swaps based on mutual agreement. You get a mutual agreement of Abbas on swaps? Come
You're
on.
not going to have a mutual agreement on anything. But if there's going to be a real peace settlement, there would be agreement on swaps. And everybody says things like this. We know where the new borders are going to be. We know they're going to include Ma'ale Adumim and the Etzion bloc.
I don't know why you say that. That is not what the Arabs and the Palestinians are saying. That
What are
is
they
not
saying?
what they're saying. Every day they say something different. But in the last few months, they've been extending. And Ma'ale Adumim,
But the US has said it.
the last time Ma'ale Adumim went out.
Nobody takes that
Why
seriously.
doesn't the US say, for example, with all the pressures it's put on on Benjamin Netanyahu, why doesn't it turn to the Palestinians and say, and guys, forget this nonsense about the Palestinian refugee right of return to Israel. It won't be, we'll never approve it. Why doesn't he say that? A little bit of balance. That's where a clear-cut example of what I say is bias.
In one of your recent op-ed columns in the Jerusalem Post, you used the metaphor of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yes.
And you wrote that one would be unable to identify even a single righteous or moderate Palestinian leader committed towards achieving a genuine peace, and you include Mahmoud Abbas in that as well, and you talk about Asari Nusseibeh as well. Your sense at the moment is, as sad or as tragic as it may be, there is not one Palestinian leader, we're not talking about the Palestinian people, there's not one Palestinian leader who you believe today represents a real opportunity to make peace with Israel.
He may be hidden, but there's certainly not one that was prepared to stand up and say it. And I can only judge not by what is in his heart, but by what he says and what he goes along with. And the Palestinian Prime Minister, for example, is regarded as a technocrat and the best of all. But even he goes along to these functions where they elevate and make saints out of these monsters.
The Palestinian Authority says they want to hold new elections, and they're going to include Hamas in these elections, and that Abbas is not going to seek re-election. By the way, you make the point that Abbas is not nearly as moderate
Absolutely.
as the American media would like to
Yes.
portray him as. You'll tell me in a moment, by the way, do Israelis think he's moderate? But my question for you in general is, what do you think the new elections would produce in terms of a peace process if they're going to include Hamas and if there is no Abbas? So it's two questions. What do the Israelis think of Abbas, and what's it going to mean if the next leadership has no Abbas?
I think Israelis today recognize Abbas not as a peace partner and understand him much better than they did 2 or 3 years ago. Because all of us, myself included, I would always try to persuade myself he's more moderate than these other monsters. But now I've come to the conclusion he just knows how to use his mouth more effectively in Western audiences. But ultimately, the goals and the behavior is not that dissimilar. He wears a tie, he looks much more respectable, and all the people in the West embrace him as a moderate. I don't think he's a moderate, and I don't think most Israelis today are in doubt as to where he stands.
Now, what will happen if, in fact, he's out and we have new elections with Hamas as part of the electoral process? What do you worry will happen as a result?
There's no question that Hamas is growing at every level. And if there was not an Israeli military presence in Yehuda and Shomron today, Hamas would be in control. And I fear that any kind of an election will only strengthen their position. Mm-hmm. But even if it doesn't strengthen their position, the Tanzim and some of the elements within the PA authority, some of their own military units, are exactly the same killers. In fact, they've killed more Israelis there from the Palestinian Authority in the last few years than Hamas. We tend to forget that because, we have to say that these are our peace partners. I think it's time for us to stop saying it. And in effect, there's a lot to be said for people telling the truth. And if we have an authority that says it as it is, instead of behaving like hypocrites and saying one thing to the people and another thing to Western audiences, it might be better for us.
By the way, just to let our audience know, Maariv, the Israeli newspaper Maariv, also did a poll. I think you're going to agree more with this one than the last one. Do you think there's a chance of reaching peace with the Palestinians? 54% said no chance at all. And I think that my own sense of now where the Israeli public is, most Israelis do not think this is possible in the near future. Maariv also asked the question about a return to the 67 borders. 58% of the respondents said it was out of the question to go back to the 67 borders. But Izzy, there was one piece of those responding who, in response to the question, should Israel go back to the 67 borders or should negotiations begin with the 67 borders, 5% answered that question by saying the occupation of the West Bank by Israel is immoral. Is the Israeli occupation of the West Bank immoral?
Well, I'd like to know what is meant by the occupation. We hear that from our enemies, but when we hear Israelis saying it, the reality is that the vast majority of Palestinians today are ruling themselves. You have the Gaza area is completely independent as a unit, and in the PA, all the cities are run by the Palestinians themselves. There's an Israeli military presence to ensure that there aren't terrorists. The daily life is only affected with regard to security. And to that extent, there's no morality where security comes in. Because if it means defending ourselves from being blown up or having terrorists coming into our country, that is very, very moral. Mm-hmm. So my answer to that is nonsense. It's a cliche. It's very nice coming from the far left, but in reality, it's nonsense.
At the GA, Peter Beinart participated in a breakout session.
Yes.
And the session was entitled, "Have We Lost That Loving Feeling?" regarding to the American Jewish community's reaction to Israel. And Peter Beinart argues yes, and when asked why, his answer is because of the Israeli occupation. And he points out that there has always been a Jewish goal, that the state of Israel would be both Jewish and democratic, and that as long as Israel includes the West Bank, obviously it can't be democratic because one does not extend voting rights to the Palestinian residents on the West Bank. And Beinart's claim made at the GA is the occupation of the West Bank is what is turning young American Jews and liberal American Jews off from Israel. And incidentally, Amos Oz was in Israel. I was in the United States recently promoting his most recent book. He appeared on the Charlie Rose show on PBS television. And he talks about the extent to which he feels the occupation has done damage and continues to do damage to the Israeli soul. So I don't want to ask you, is it immoral? I want you to talk about how you feel personally and how you feel the Israeli public feels about the fact that the occupation continues, and what would Israelis like to do about it?
I think,
you understand
yes,
that this
yes,
is how,
I do.
This is how the
yes,
issue
yes.
is framed
yes, I understand.
on the American scene.
First of all, I think that when the chips are down, American Jews are far more pro-Israel than is suggested. And I think that Birthright has had an extraordinary success with young people, because despite what we read from the Beinarts and Amos Oz, most of these people come back imbued with a positive attitude towards Israel, and long may it continue to serve American Jewish interests.
Although the Jews he's talking about, the young Jews he's talking about on college campuses, most of them haven't been to Israel.
Well, there's still huge numbers coming to Israel. Now, there is an alienation, and that part of an alienation is a form of assimilation. The liberal is becoming part of the liberal establishment. The liberal establishment, the far left liberal establishment, sees Israel as an imperialist ogre and full stop. Now, all of us would like to see ourselves in a situation where we don't rule over a single Arab. I speak for myself, and I'm sure that I speak for 85% of Israelis. We would like nothing better than not rule over Arabs. Let them live their lives. Let's live together or separately, not rule over them.
And
but
why
when the issue...
Then why hasn't it happened?
It hasn't happened because we have to live. Because it is an issue of security, and the hypocrisy and the irresponsibility of these people that babble on about occupation, knowing full well that if we just walked away from there, even those people in Tel Aviv would suddenly be getting what the people are getting in southern Israel now from the former Gaza areas. I mean, this is part of our security. And as long as we have a hostile enemy that seeks to destroy us, we have to protect ourselves. We don't want to rule over Arabs. We rule over very few Arabs. But our presence, our physical military presence in those areas is there to protect us and our children and our grandchildren. And that's the only reason we're there. Otherwise, we'd be out yesterday.
I wished someone would have asked Peter at this breakout session, what do you want Israel to do? And why do you think they're there? And I wish you had been there to ask these questions of him and to say to him in this context what you said here. Because I'm going to now, I hope to paraphrase you accurately. The vast majority of Israeli people have no interest in occupying the West Bank.
Yes.
We're not there because we want the territory.
Yes.
And you and I have spoken before. There have been times in Israeli history where there was, for a brief moment, a vision of greater Israel.
Yes.
That's long since
Yes.
come and gone,
Yes.
Isi. And that the Israeli people do not want to be occupying or controlling the West Bank. The only reason we're there is that the other side won't let us leave.
Yes.
Because if we were to leave, we would be exposing our children and the men and women of Israel to all kinds of assault. And I don't understand why it's not that simply said anytime this issue is raised. But it's not simply said.
Yeah.
And I'll say another thing, and you comment on it. You know, every now and then I say to you, I understand what a Jewish neshama you have as well. And sometime I just love to talk to you about the Judaism of America and the Judaism of Israel. But we never get to it. But there are Jewish values. And very often you will hear those in America say something like, we want Israel to live up to the highest of Jewish values. And you don't oppress another people. And the answer is, of course you don't oppress another people. But there is a Jewish value that you've alluded to, which is never spoken about. And it's the obligation. The Jewish value says you have an obligation to protect yourself against the rodef.
Yes.
If somebody is coming to pursue you, you don't have an option. You must defend yourself. As long as we feel that the Palestinian people really want an end to the state of Israel, they remain a rodef.
Absolutely.
And the Jewish state of Israel and the Jewish people have an obligation, a Jewish value obligation, to protect themselves. At the same time, they have an obligation to try, never stop trying, to develop a peace partner and do what they can. But Isi, I wish this was said more often by Jewish leaders. We have a Jewish value that says you must protect yourself. And I wanted somebody to say to Peter, Peter, what do you want the Jewish people to do? And when we left Gaza, we were criticized for it. So that it is a box that is very hard to respond to unless you understand the entire perspective of the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition. You basically agree with me.
Absolutely. We're on the same wavelength.
At this same meeting, a lovely college student got up and asked a question. She is from Israel. She's now studying at the University of Maryland. And she said, I feel I've been betrayed. I grew up in a Zionist household, and I was lied to. After the session was over, I took her aside on Shalom TV. I asked her if she would explain to the audience, how was she lied to? She said, first, when I was growing up in Israeli schools, the map of Israel I was always shown included the West Bank and Gaza. Is that true? Are Israeli children shown a map of Israel that includes the West Bank and Gaza as if it's Israel proper?
Absolutely untrue. Absolutely false. And I mean, this is the worst kind of cheap demagoguery on the part of the left to come out with such nonsense.
Yes, I have never seen anything like this. Okay. Then she said the other lie. Is that the only lie? No, she said there's another lie. She was taught as a child what many of us were taught in Talmud Torahs growing up in the 50s and 60s, that every Palestinian or every Arab, they weren't called Palestinians in the 50s and 60s.
Arabs.
Every Arab who left Palestine in 47, 48, when the State of Israel was established, did so because they were told by the Arab leadership that there was going to be a holy crusade, a jihad, they should leave, the Arab army was going to come in, sweep all the Israelis into the Mediterranean Sea, and then the Arabs could come back and reclaim their homes. And that she has learned since from Benny Morris and others that it wasn't that simple. That in fact there were instances in which Arabs living in pre-state Palestine were encouraged and even forced out of the State of Israel, of Eretz Yisrael. And she felt this was a betrayal by the Jewish establishment. What would you say to her?
I would say to her, the vast majority did flee in those terms, and the statements that were made calling on them are there on public record, and there's nothing to argue about. And in a war, there were incidents and there were cases where atrocities of some sort may have taken place, and there certainly were areas, they say, in Lud and a few places like that, where Arabs were encouraged to move out by local commanders, but that was a minority. But so what? This is the part and parcel of what happens when a country faces war. And there are bad things that happen in war that shouldn't happen. And I think it's true, we would probably be putting ourselves in the 1940s in a totally 100% pure category, and as time goes on, we look at ourselves more critically and say, yes, there were this and there was that. But in a total context, our behaviour as a country that was under fire was extraordinary, because in most societies there would have been a complete evacuation of all the Palestinians, and we would not be having any internal issues with Arabs. They would have all been pushed out by most societies where there would have been ethnic cleansing under such circumstances. Because one has to remember, we were told in 1948 that every Jew that remained there would be killed and murdered and butchered. And the fact that we have 20% of the country is still Arab, and they may be discriminated in the same way as Afro-Americans have some forms of discrimination. They're still basically living in a democratic society, and ask any of them if they'll go to any other Arab society, and 99% of them will not because the territory there is any different than it is across the road, but because the society in which they're living is a democratic society, and they're much happier and better off than they are.
You are not trying to say that the treatment of the Arab Israeli is acceptable in terms of a moral standard within the Jewish community.
I'm saying it reflects a society, it reflects a group within society which has to move upwards and has not reached total equality in many respects.
Does that pain you?
And that is happening
Does
and
that
is improving.
pain you?
Yes, it does. I would like to see them have total equality. I would like to see Ethiopian Jews have total equality. I would like to see that every immigration group, every migrant group has had to fight its way up. And Jews in America had to fight their way up in the same way as Afro-Americans had to fight their way up. And today, Palestinians are much, much better off than they've ever been and will continue to be. But if you ask me, do they get exactly the same? Are they on the same level as Israelis? As Israeli Jews? No. And that's not a good thing, but it's in a process. That's society.
Yes. Israel is not a perfect society.
It's not. If it pretends to be a perfect society, then it's telling lies. There's no perfect society in the world.
There's no perfect society. But the Jew tends to be very impatient
And
with an imperfect
self-critical
Israel.
to the point of ripping himself apart sometimes. I don't think anybody is as self-critical as we are ourselves.
By the way, there's something nice about that.
Absolutely.
If a Peter Beinart represents a view again among young American Jews on college campuses, that Israel's behavior on the West Bank is in some way unacceptable, or that there are American Jews who think that Benjamin Netanyahu's refusal to extend the settlement freeze was a mistake. Do those American Jews have the right to A, raise this in a public Jewish forum, at a synagogue meeting, at the GA, And do they have the right to write op-ed pieces in the New York Times?
I think there's a distinction between the two. I think within a Jewish framework, Jews should feel free to express themselves as they want to. Now, I'm not suggesting that we are a closed society, but to go to newspapers which are hostile and seeking to undermine us, one has to take into account the ramifications of what one is doing to the overall situation of the state. And we're a state under siege at the moment. And I think one has to be very hesitant before one comes and buckets Israel on issues which do impact on our security in a paper like the New York Times. And there's a big distinction between that and expressing it within a Jewish framework. Everybody has a viewpoint. Get two Jews and you have three political views, and that's fine. But on security issues today, we are going through a very, very tough period. And between being broadly critical and being specifically calling on outside parties to put pressure on us, that's also a dividing line. I can't give you a black and white formula there, but I'm saying overall, number one, what I think is obscene is to call on any foreign government, for Jews to call on a foreign government to put pressure on the democratically elected government of Israel. That to me is obscene. Let them come and live, and their children and they themselves face the consequences of their actions. Then they're entitled, like all of us Israelis, to be critical of our government as we are. And believe me, we're very, very critical. Everybody's critical of the government. Even supporters of the government are critical of the government. And you've got to weigh that up, on the other hand, about talking about things, having different views, and expressing them in a restrained and intelligent manner amongst ourselves. And even letting non-Jews know occasionally, well, we don't always agree with them. Of course you don't have to agree with them. We're not a monolithic society. Jews have every conceivable kind of attitude within the framework, and they should feel free. What I'm talking about is a calculated efforts to try to influence policies against the democratically elected government. That's where I really draw the line.
All right, I can't have you on without asking you to comment on a very controversial column you wrote about the release of Gilad Shalit. My sense is that every Israeli rejoiced for him personally and for his father and his mother, but there was division in the Jewish community, in the Israeli community, as to whether the price paid, was way too high, and whether it set precedents that will come back to haunt the state of Israel. So you fearlessly wrote your own column, and you had some serious reservations about the trade. So I want you to explain to me and our audience why did you write what you wrote, and where do you stand now?
Before I do that, let me say 80% of Israelis clapped and supported the scheme that was done, which in a sense shows both the beauty of Israel and the Achilles heel of Israel. Because
they supported the trade of one for 1,027. Yes. And because that, you claim, both is the good and the Achilles heel.
It's the good because every one of us began to identify and felt like the father. And the kind of thought, Gilad is our son, how would we behave? And we all know how. I know how I would behave. I would behave exactly the same way as any human being would. I would say, to hell with anything, my son. But what I'm saying to you is, the media, and in particular politicians, have to bear and take account they're the fathers of a nation, not the fathers of a person. And they have to take account the consequences. And if the consequence of an act are going to lead to greater calamities and greater potential killings and murders, that's something they have to take into account. And if it is going to lead to a precedent which is going to encourage the Palestinians to do more of this and to take whatever risks, knowing that get one Jew and you'll get 1,000 mass murderers, this is something very, very difficult, and I think no other country would have done it. So it's a beautiful thing to show how we look after our children and how we feel and the lengths we're prepared to do so. But it's the heart speaking, not the mind. And the mind has to, and I'm saying that responsible politicians in my opinion, have a mind. They have to take into account the practical ramifications. The practical ramifications are frightening of such actions if they're going to be continued in the past, in the future. And it's very, very worrying. We all were overjoyed because somehow or others become part of our psyche. One boy become part of our psyche. But if that's going to be the basis, God knows what they'll ask the next time. And one also has to take into account the people whose children and grandchildren were murdered. For some of them were absolutely heroic and said, we don't care. But for the majority of them, and I know some of them, to see the killers, the mass murderers of their children being hailed as heroes, being feted, and going back to their old business in many cases, which they will, this is pretty tough stuff also. So that, I think, sums up Israel. It shows the beauty of Israel, it shows the weakness of Israel, and shows that the Jewish people is unlike any other people, because no other nation could have conceivably behaved in that way. I can assure you the United States, Europe, no nation would behave in that way.
By the way, I understand the dilemma. Why do you use the word weakness? Why is it a sign of weakness?
It's a sign of weakness to take an act which you save one person, but you may be killing 500 people. That is a sign of weakness.
The commanders that I spoke with, IDF commanders, argued that if we are sending our young people, our young, mostly men, but women too, into battle, and they don't have a choice by and large, we make a promise to them. We will always bring you home. Part of what motivates them to be willing to go into battle is our promise. And if we don't bring them home, whatever the price, we are breaking a promise to them that will ultimately cause other young people not to believe in the IDF the way we want them to believe in it. And that as a result, these commanders argue to me, we put the state of Israel in greater jeopardy by undermining the confidence of our young people that we will bring them home. That is a greater risk than the potential, and only the potential risk, of what these released terrorists might do. Does that persuade you at all?
Not the slightest, and I think it's a rationalization which they don't believe in themselves. When young men, my children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, go in the army, they know they're not going in for games. They can get killed, they can get maimed, all sorts of terrible things can happen to them. This is one of the terrible things that can happen to them. And I believe that we have an obligation, if one of our soldiers is caught, to do everything possible as long as we don't inflict on the nation worse things. And I believe, I wish I was wrong, and maybe I'll be proven wrong, I wish it. I believe that doing this is an invitation for greater bad things to happen. It also creates an environment in which the society as such is going to be crushed the next time. And if we give 500 instead of 1,000, we'll say bravo. But no other state would do it for obvious reasons. And Netanyahu was under enormous political pressure because he himself, as you know, had written in his book, the one thing we must never do is to negotiate over terrorists. Now, as I said, if I was a father, I'd be doing exactly what Noam Shalit did for his son. But
that's not the point.
But that's not the point. The point is,
what does the society do?
And society has difficulties there. But as I say, it's also, as I said before, a reflection of a beautiful society.
Yes. Were you proud of Israel in any way when they brought Gilad Shalit
yes.
home? You were.
Of course.
You were touched
torn.
personally.
I was torn. Every Israeli was.
Did you in any way hesitate before writing your column?
Yes.
Tell me.
I hesitated because I didn't want to say what the mind was saying because my heart was on the other side. I was torn in half, and I started it off by very carefully saying what a great day it was for all Israelis. And I pointed out 80% supported it. It's quite extraordinary.
But you felt it wasn't necessary to write that column.
Well, I always believe that things that are not being said should be said. And my columns have always tried to veer on the things that a lot of other people find politically convenient not to say, and I try to say it. Although I had a lot of people. I was very angry with some of the people from Chutz La'aretz who wrote to me, some of the right wings from outside of Israel, who wrote to me and, took my column up and started saying this is disgusting government, irresponsible. And I actually berated them. I said, you're sitting over there, you don't understand the traumas we all went through here. Because bringing this guy back was something very important for us as well. I'm torn and contradicting myself as I speak to you now. You can see the emotion, the heart, and the mind.
You give me chills, and it is really one of the reasons why I love you so much. And I have always respected both the passion and the intellect you bring to everything you discuss when it comes to world Jewry and problems facing the state of Israel. And it's not about whether you're 100% right on every issue. What you always do is articulate an issue in a way that makes us think. You often illuminate and no one else is willing to do that. The courage you have with some of the things you write about, whether it's the way in which Rabin is being used by what you consider to be those who have ulterior motives to using his memory, to the Gilad Shalit piece, to your championing the Holocaust survivors who you feel have been victimized by the Claims Conference. Time and time again, Isi, you bring issues to the consciousness of the Jewish community in a way that is both intelligent and moving. I am proud to be your friend, and I'm proud to be able to present you to the Shalom TV audience, and I wish you only go from strength to strength. You may not stop writing. I consider you now to be the leading columnist in the Jewish world. I hope everyone reads your column every single week, and they don't have to agree with you, but you will always make us think and make us feel and make us proud to be Jews. And I wish you kol tuva hatzlacha.
Thank you very much. That was
120 and then some.
That was too kind, Mark.
Not at all.
Too kind. But I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
It's always a great pleasure to be with you. I wish we had a few more like you, because you bring out, as an interviewer, you have great skills. You know it, I don't have to tell you, but you have great skills.
Thank you, Isi. Thank you very much. And those were the thoughts of Isi Leibler, whose column appears weekly in the Jerusalem Post. And if you wish to receive Isi's weekly column online at your on your desktop, on your computer, on your iPad, you can do so. Simply contact Isi at ileibler@leibler.com, and you'll be put on his email list and you'll receive his column. Or again, you can go to the Jerusalem Post and read it there as well. Of course, as always, I'd love to know your thoughts and reactions to the ideas expressed by Isi Leibler. Please write me, email me, post on our Facebook wall, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. And so until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.